On the afternoon of May 13th, Yitzen Jobai Bashi, a man named Mehmet Ali Aka, stood in St. Peter's Square and fired 4 shots at Pope John Paul II. 2 of the bullets struck the Pope. One passed through his abdomen, perforating the colon and small intestine in multiple places. Another struck his left hand. A third grazed his right arm. The 4th missed entirely. John Paul II collapsed in the arms of his secretary, Stanisław Dziwisz, who was sitting beside him in the open Pope-mobile as it moved through the crowd. He was conscious enough, according to Dziwisz's later account, to say that he forgave the man who had shot him before he lost consciousness from blood loss. He was taken by ambulance to the Gemelli Polyclinic Hospital in Rome. He was in surgery for 5 hours and 21 minutes. He survived. In the days that followed, as he recovered in the hospital, he asked for something. He asked to read the Third Secret of Fatima. The Third Secret was a text that had been written in 1944 by a Portuguese nun named Lucia Santos, one of the 3 children who had claimed, in 1917, to have witnessed apparitions of the Virgin Mary in the fields outside the small town of Fatima, Portugal. The text had been sealed in an envelope and sent to the Vatican. It had been read by Pope John XXIII in 1960, who had decided not to publish it. It had been read by Pope Paul VI in 1965, who had also decided not to publish it. It had been sitting in the Vatican's secret archives, in a sealed envelope, for 24 years before John Paul II became Pope and John Paul II, in the 3 years of his pontificate before the shooting, had not read it. Now, in the hospital bed at the Gemelli Polyclinic, he read it. His personal secretary brought the text from the Vatican. John Paul II read it, and according to the accounts of the people who were present, accounts that were recorded years later, with a specific uncertainty of recollections shaped by subsequent events, he said something after reading it that would become one of the most discussed statements in the modern history of the Church. He said, "This is my destiny," or words to that effect. The precise wording is disputed. The accounts differ in detail, but the substance is consistent. John Paul II read the Third Secret of Fatima in the hospital, where he was recovering from an assassination attempt that had occurred on the anniversary of the first Fatima apparition. And he concluded that the text he had read described what had just happened to him. He did not publish the text. He recovered from his wounds. He traveled to Fatima in May 1982, exactly 1 year after the assassination attempt, and placed the bullet that had been removed from his body into the crown of the statue of Our Lady of Fatima. He consecrated Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in 1984, fulfilling, according to the official Vatican interpretation, a specific request made in the Second Secret of Fatima. The Soviet Union collapsed between 1989 and 1991, and the Third Secret, the text that John Paul II had read in the hospital and described as his destiny, the text that 2 previous popes had read and declined to publish, the text that had been generating speculation for 40 years about what it contained, remained sealed for another 16 years, until the year 2000, when Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, released it to the world. The release did not end the speculation. It intensified it, because the text that was released described something that had not happened, or had not happened in the way the text described, or it happened in a way that required interpretation so extensive and so carefully managed that the interpretation itself became the subject of the speculation that the release was supposed to end. This is the story of how a reported apparition in a Portuguese village in 1917 became, over the course of the 20th century, perhaps the most politically consequential Marian prophetic misinformation system of the modern Catholic era. Not because it was fabricated, not because the children lied, or the church invented, or the events were simply the product of mass suggestion in a credulous population, but because the church's management of the information created the conditions under which a reported supernatural event could function as a powerful misinformation mechanism, so effective that it produced and continues to produce exactly the kind of narrative that the institutional church was supposedly trying to prevent. The secret that was kept too long, the revelation that revealed too little, the mechanism that the church built to manage a prophecy and that the prophecy used to manage the church. Fatima is a small town in central Portugal, in the region called the Extremaduran Highlands, rolling agricultural land, the kind of landscape that has been grazed by sheep and worked by small farmers for centuries before anyone who would ever read this account was born. In 1917, it was a village of perhaps a few thousand people, Catholic, as Portugal was Catholic not merely in the nominal sense of a population that identified with the church's institutional presence without particularly engaging with its spiritual content, but in the specific, embedded, daily practice sense of a rural community for which the church's calendar organized the year and the church's rituals marked the transitions of life. The three children who would become the central figures of the Fatima story were not unusual children, in any obvious way. For this environment, Lucia Santos was 10 years old. She was the daughter of a local farmer, the youngest of 7 children. A girl who had been involved in the pastoral life of the region since she was old enough to tend sheep. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her, intelligent and assertive, a natural leader among her peers. A girl who told stories with the specific energy of someone who understood the effect of a well-told story on an audience. Francisco Moro was 9 years old. He was Lucia's cousin, the son of her mother's sister. He was, by the accounts, a quieter child than Lucia, more interior, more given to the specific kind of absorbed attention that the mystical tradition associates with contemplative personality types. Jacinta Marto was 7 years old. She was Francisco's sister, Lucia's younger cousin. She was, by every account, the most emotionally intense of the three, a child who, once she had experienced what the three would later describe as their visions, became consumed by them in a way that the other two did not. On May 13th, 1917, a Sunday, the month of May being, in the Catholic calendar, the month of Mary, the three children were tending sheep in a field known as the Cova da Iria, outside Fatima, according to their accounts that they gave immediately, repeatedly, and with a consistency that the church's later investigation would find remarkable. They saw a flash of light over a small oak tree, and then they saw a figure, a woman, young, dressed in white, luminous, standing above the oak tree, speaking to them. The figure told them to return to the Cova da Iria on the 13th of each month for the next 6 months. She told them that she would tell them who she was and what she wanted. She told them that they should pray the rosary for peace and the end of the war. She did not tell them her name. Not yet. The children returned home and told their families what they had seen. The families reacted with the specific mixture of skepticism and anxiety that reports of supernatural experiences in small, tightly knit communities tend to produce. Lucia's mother was particularly skeptical. She was concerned that her daughter was lying, or imagining, or making a fool of herself and her family. She tried, in the way of a practical woman with a strong sense of social consequence, to discourage Lucia from repeating the story. Lucia repeated it anyway. The children returned to the Cova da Iria on June 13th. This time, a small crowd had gathered to observe. The crowd did not see the figure, but they reported observing something, a change in Lucia's demeanor during the period when she was, apparently, in conversation with the invisible visitor, a quality of absorption, a different kind of attention. Lucia reported that the figure had told them, among other things, that Francisco and Jacinta would be taken to heaven soon, but that Lucia would remain on Earth longer, that she had a specific mission that required her to stay. Francisco died in April 1920, at 10 years old, of pneumonia following the Spanish flu pandemic. Jacinta died in February 1920, at 9 years old, of pleuropneumonia. The prediction would later be read as accurate, or the prediction had been constructed retrospectively, in the way that prophetic traditions construct retrospective accuracy. Or the children had predicted what was statistically plausible. 2 young children in a region devastated by the Spanish flu pandemic had a significant probability of dying young. Or the prediction was genuine. The historical record does not resolve this question. What it records is the effect. The effect was that the crowd that gathered at the Cova da Iria on July 13th, 1917, the third monthly apparition, was considerably larger than the crowd that had gathered in June. The apparition of July 13th, 1917, is the one that produced the 3 secrets. The figure appeared again to the 3 children. The crowd, now numbering in the hundreds, observed the children's absorbed attention and the specific physical phenomena that witnesses consistently described: a dimming of the sun, a change in the quality of the light, a sound that some described as thunder and others described as a buzzing and others described as a voice too low to make out. The children were in conversation with someone the crowd could not see. Afterward, Lucia described what the figure had told them. The first part of the message was a vision the children had been shown. Lucia said, a vision of hell, souls falling into fire, demons. The specific topography of Catholic eschatological imagination rendered in vivid sensory detail. The purpose of the vision, the figure explained, was to motivate the children to pray for the souls who would otherwise end up there. The second part of the message was a prophecy. The war, the First World War, which was at that moment in its 3rd year and showing no signs of ending, would end. But if people did not stop offending God, a worse war would begin during the pontificate of a future pope. Russia would spread its errors through the world, but in the end, the figure's immaculate heart would triumph. Russia would be consecrated and converted. A period of peace would be granted to the world. The third part of the message, the third secret, Lucia did not share. She said that the figure had told her to keep the third part secret for now. This is the moment at which the story of Fatima becomes the story of the mechanism, because the decision to keep the third part secret, a decision attributed to the figure herself, but necessarily filtered through Lucia's account of what the figure said, and therefore a decision made, in the final analysis, by a 10-year-old girl. This decision created the conditions for everything that followed. Not the vision of hell, not the prophecy about the wars in Russia, not even the extraordinary event of October 13th. The miracle of the sun that would draw 70,000 people to the Cova da Iria and provide the most extensively documented evidence for the Fatima apparitions. The secret, the third part that was not told, the gap in the information. That gap became the mechanism. The miracle of the sun occurred on October 13th. Itenjobai Ishitsi. It was the 6th and final apparition. It was the one at which the figure finally identified herself. She told Lucia that she was the Lady of the Rosary, that she wanted a chapel built in her honor at the Cova da Iria, that the war would end soon, and then, according to the accounts of the approximately 70,000 people who had gathered at the field, accounts collected by journalists and church investigators in the days that followed, the sun did something. It moved, or appeared to move. The accounts vary in their specifics, but they share a core description. The sun became visible through the clouds. It appeared to spin, or rotate. It changed colors. It seemed to plunge toward the earth and then return to its position in the sky. The entire sequence lasted approximately 10 minutes. 70,000 people reported seeing it. The event was witnessed by people who were not religious pilgrims, by journalists who had come to report on what they expected to be a non-event, by skeptics who had come to observe what they expected to be a demonstration of popular credulity, by scientists and intellectuals who had come out of curiosity rather than faith. Most of them reported seeing something. Not all of them described the same thing. The accounts are, as scholars who have examined them note, diverse enough to be consistent with a range of explanations: mass suggestion, an atmospheric phenomenon, a specific kind of optical illusion produced by the particular conditions of that day. None of these explanations is fully satisfying. None of them is conclusive. The Church, after an investigation that lasted 13 years, recognized the Fatima apparitions as worthy of belief in 1930. Worthy of belief, not mandatory belief, not a dogmatic definition, but a judgment that the events were authentic in the sense that the Church uses that word for private revelations. The investigations had found nothing that contradicted Catholic doctrine, and the fruits, the spiritual effects on the people involved were consistent with genuine supernatural experience. The children were telling the truth, as far as the Church could determine, or they believed they were telling the truth, or the truth they were telling was of a kind that defied the categories available for evaluating it. The Church did not resolve this ambiguity. It recognized the apparitions and left the ambiguity in place, which was, as subsequent history would demonstrate, which left in place exactly the kind of ambiguity that later allowed the mechanism to endure. Lucia Santos did not die when the figure had implied she would. She outlived Francisco and Jacinta by decades. She became a Carmelite nun, entered a monastery, and spent the rest of her long life. She died in 2005, at 97 years old, in the specific combination of prayer, correspondence, and institutional engagement that her role as the primary surviving witness of Fatima required. She was the keeper of the secrets, not only the third secret, which she eventually wrote down and surrendered to the Vatican, but the entire narrative of Fatima, the memories, the interpretations, the ongoing relationship with the apparitions that she had experienced as a child and that had organized her entire adult life. She wrote several memoirs. She engaged in extensive correspondence with church authorities, with theologians, with the faithful who sought her guidance. She made specific claims about what the figure had told her and what the figure required, claims that, over the decades, became increasingly specific and increasingly consequential. The second secret had specified that Russia must be consecrated to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Lucia, in her correspondence with church authorities from the 1930s onward, was specific about what this consecration required. It had to be performed by the Pope in union with all the bishops of the world, and it had to specifically name Russia. This specificity was significant, because it meant that the fulfillment of the second secret's promise, the conversion of Russia, the period of peace, was dependent on an institutional act that the Church had to perform in a particular way. The prophecy had generated a requirement. The requirement had to be met before the promise could be fulfilled. The popes of the 20th century managed this requirement with a specific combination of acknowledgement and deferral that characterizes institutional management of inconvenient obligations. Pius XII performed a consecration of Russia in 1942. Lucia said it was insufficient because it had not been performed in union with all the bishops of the world. Paul VI performed a consecration in 1964. Lucia said it was insufficient because it had not specifically named Russia. The requirement kept not being met. The promise kept not being fulfilled. The mechanism kept running. The third secret was written down in 1944. Lucia had been ill seriously enough that she believed she might die without having committed the text to paper. She wrote it down, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it to the Bishop of Leiria with instructions that it should be delivered to the Pope or opened and published after her death, or in 1960, whichever came first. The specification of 1960 was, and remains, one of the most discussed details of the Third Secret's history. Why 1960, Lucia did not explain. In the letter that accompanied the sealed envelope, why she had chosen that year, she said only that the text would be clearer when read in that year's context. This explanation was insufficient to satisfy the curiosity it generated, and the curiosity it generated was considerable, because a sealed text, attributed to a supernatural source, with a specified opening date, in the possession of the Vatican, had all the structural elements of a mystery in the specific form that generates the most intense and durable public fascination. The mystery was not about whether the text existed. It was about what it said, and the question of what it said left unanswered by the Church's silence for decades became the space into which every fear, every hope, every apocalyptic expectation that the 20th century was capable of generating was projected. To understand what the three secrets of Fatima are, you need to understand what they are not. They are not a single document. They are not a text that was produced in one sitting, by one person, at one moment. They are a layered construction, a series of accounts, produced over decades, by a single witness whose relationship to the events she was describing became more complex, more institutionally shaped, and more politically consequential with each passing year. Lucia Santos was 10 years old when she reported the July 1917 apparition that contained the secrets. She was in her 30s when she wrote down the Third Secret. She was in her 90s when the Vatican finally published it. Between the child in the field and the old woman in the monastery, there were 80 years of institutional relationship, 80 years of correspondence with popes and cardinals and theologians, 80 years of being asked to clarify and interpret and confirm, and occasionally to revise what she had said before. The secrets, as they came to be understood by the time the Vatican published them, were not simply the direct testimony of a child. They were the product of a long process of institutional refinement, a process in which the Church's needs and the witnesses' memories and the theological frameworks available for interpreting both had all shaped the final form of what was recorded. This does not mean the secrets are fabricated. It means they are historical documents in the full sense of that phrase, products of specific circumstances, specific relationships, specific institutional pressures, specific moments of decision about what to include and what to omit and how to frame what was included. Understanding them requires understanding the layers. The first secret was the vision of hell. It was the first of three things that Lucia said the figure had shown them during the July 1917 apparition shown. Not told. A vision. A direct sensory experience, rendered in terms that the Catholic tradition had been using to describe hell for centuries. Lucia's account of the vision recorded in her memoirs, which she wrote in the late 1930s and early 1940s at the instruction of her superiors, describes a vast sea of fire, plunging souls, demons, and the specific imagery of torment that the medieval iconographic tradition had made familiar. The souls were transparent, burning, screaming. The demons were dark and terrifying. The figure told the children that the vision was a demonstration of where souls go when they die in mortal sin, a demonstration intended to motivate the children, and through them the faithful who would eventually hear the account, to pray for the salvation of sinners. The theological content of the first secret was, by the standards of 20th century Catholic doctrine, entirely orthodox. It was not controversial. It was not surprising. It was, in the specific form that Lucia recorded it, exactly what anyone with a thorough knowledge of the Catholic mystical tradition and a vivid imagination might produce as an account of a supernatural vision of hell. This observation is not offered as a debunking of the First Secret's authenticity. It is offered as an observation about its function. The First Secret served a specific purpose within the overall Fatima narrative. It established the stakes. It demonstrated that the message was serious, that the consequences of the behavior the figure was critiquing were not merely earthly and political but eternal and spiritual. It created the motivational framework within which the practical demands of the Second Secret pray the Rosary. Consecrate Russia. Make sacrifices made sense. It was the diagnosis. The Second Secret was the prognosis. The Second Secret was the prophecy. Lucia's account of it, as recorded in her memoirs, is the most historically specific of the three and the most problematic. From the perspective of evaluating its authenticity, the figure told the children, Lucia wrote, that the First World War would end, but if people did not stop offending God, a worse war would break out, indicated by a night illuminated by an unknown light. This worse war would begin during the pontificate of Pius XI. Russia would spread its errors throughout the world, provoking wars and persecutions of the Church. The good would be martyred. The Holy Father would have much to suffer. Various nations would be annihilated. In the end, the Immaculate Heart of Mary would triumph. Russia would be consecrated and converted. A period of peace would be granted to the world. This account contains specific historical references that were not present in the version that Lucia gave immediately after the July 1917 apparition. In 1917, Lucia's immediate account of the Second Secret did not mention Pius XI by name. It did not specify the mechanism of the worse war. The specific references to Pius XI's pontificate and the night illuminated by an unknown light appeared in the memoirs that Lucia wrote in 1941 and 1942. This is a significant gap. The apparition occurred in 1917. The specific historical reference to Pius XI, who did not become Pope until 1922, appeared in Lucia's account in 1941. The year after the Second World War had begun under the pontificate of Pius XI's successor, Pius XII. The aurora borealis of January 1938, an unusually vivid northern lights display that was visible across Europe, and that Lucia later identified as the predicted sign of the impending war, was retrospectively incorporated into the prophecy's fulfillment. The account Lucia wrote in 1941 was more specific about the events preceding the Second World War than the account she had given in 1917, because in 1941, she knew what had happened. The prophecy, in its recorded form, shows the hallmarks of vaticinium ex eventu, the technique we have examined in previous episodes of this series, in which past events are described in prophetic terms after they have occurred. This does not mean Lucia was dishonest. It means that memory is not a recording device. It is a constructive process, a process that incorporates subsequent experience into the recollection of prior events in ways that the person doing the remembering may not be aware of. Lucia, recalling in 1941 what she had experienced in 1917, was recalling through the lens of everything that had happened between those two dates. The Second World War, the rise of totalitarianism, the persecution of the Church in Soviet Russia. These were not simply background context for her recollection. They were the interpretive framework through which she understood what the figure had told her. The prophecy appears more accurate about the Second World War in its recorded form because the most specific version of the text was written after the war had already begun. Not in the sense that Lucia fabricated it, in the sense that her memory of what the figure had said was shaped, inevitably and unconsciously, by her knowledge of what had happened. This is the mechanism of the Second Secret, not necessarily a lie. a memory shaped by time and institutional expectation into something that appeared more specifically prophetic than the original experience may have been. The requirement of the second secret, the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, deserves particular attention, because it is the element of the Fatima revelations that most directly shaped the institutional behavior of the Church in the 20th century. The figure, according to Lucia's account, had specified that Russia needed to be consecrated in a particular way by the Pope, in union with all the bishops of the world, explicitly naming Russia only if this specific act was performed would the promised conversion of Russia and the period of peace be granted. The requirement was specific enough to generate a clear institutional obligation. It was also specific enough to generate endless dispute about whether any given act of consecration fulfilled it. Pius XII consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart in 1942 during the Second World War, when the Soviet Union was both an ally of the Western powers against Nazi Germany and a continuing object of Catholic concern as a persecutor of the Church. The consecration did not specifically name Russia. Lucia said it was insufficient. John III made no specific consecration act in response to the Fatima requirements. Paul VI consecrated the world to Mary in 1964, during the Second Vatican Council, explicitly in union with the Council Fathers who were assembled, which came closer to fulfilling the requirement of episcopal union, but it still did not specifically name Russia. Lucia said it was still insufficient. John Paul II attempted a series of consecrations before the one that Lucia eventually accepted as valid, the consecration of March 25th. Performed in St. Peter's Square in union with bishops around the world, which did not specifically name Russia, but which Lucia subsequently confirmed, in a letter written after the fact, was the consecration that the figure had requested. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The connection between the consecration of 1984 and the collapse of the Soviet Union was made, immediately and publicly, by John Paul II and by the Fatima devotees who had been waiting for exactly this fulfillment. The prophecy had been confirmed, or the Soviet Union had collapsed for the complex reasons that historians of the Cold War have analyzed, reasons that include the structural economic failures of the Soviet system, the military overextension of the Afghanistan campaign, the political reforms initiated by Gorbachev, the sustained pressure of the American military buildup, and the specific vulnerabilities of an authoritarian system that had never resolved the fundamental tensions between its ideological commitments and the lived experience of its citizens. The prophecy and the historians describe the same event through different frameworks. The prophecy's framework is not falsifiable by the historian's analysis. The historian's analysis is not falsifiable by the prophecy's framework. They coexist, as they have always coexisted, as the mechanism requires them to. The Third Secret was written in January 1944. Lucia had been seriously ill the previous autumn, ill enough that her bishop, concerned that the Third Secret would die with her before she could commit it to writing, had formally ordered her to write it down. She had been reluctant. She later wrote that she felt an unusual difficulty in writing the Third Secret, as if the task required overcoming a specific interior resistance that the other accounts had not required. She wrote it. She sealed the text in an envelope. She wrote on the outside of the envelope that it could be opened after her death, or in 1960, whichever came first. She sent it to the Bishop of Leiria. The Bishop of Leiria held it for 13 years, until 1957, when he sent it to the Vatican. The envelope sat in the Vatican's secret archives, in the specific location reserved for documents related to Fatima, until Pope John XXIII opened it in August 1959. John XXIII read the text. He said, according to the accounts of those who were with him, that the text did not concern his pontificate. He resealed it. He placed it back in the archives. He did not publish it. He convened the Second Vatican Council. He died in June 1963, without having published the Third Secret. The decision of John Duxent III not to publish the Third Secret in or around 1960, the year that Lucia had specified, is the decision that, more than any other, created the mechanism of the Fatima misinformation. Not because John III was wrong to make the decision. The decision may have been entirely reasonable. The text of the Third Secret, as eventually published, is not obviously the kind of thing that needed to be published in 1960 on any specific theological or pastoral grounds. It contained a vision, a symbolic sequence, an imagery of persecution and suffering did not require immediate public disclosure in the way that an urgent practical instruction would have. The decision may have been pragmatic. 1960 was a year of considerable Cold War tension. The Second Vatican Council was being prepared. The geopolitical and institutional context in which the Third Secret would be received was not obviously favorable to the kind of apocalyptic speculation that a document attributed to a Marian apparition would inevitably generate. The decision may have been personal. John Duxent III had read the text. He had concluded that it did not concern his pontificate. He may have believed that the appropriate time for its publication was not yet, and that a future pope would determine when the time was right. Whatever the reasons, the decision not to publish transformed the Third Secret from a private document in a Vatican archive into the most discussed, undisclosed text in the modern history of the Church. Because the year 1960 had passed, and the text had not been published, and everyone who knew that the text existed, and knew that 1960 had passed without its publication, now knew or believed they knew that the Church had made a specific decision to suppress a specific revelation. The suppression might have had legitimate reasons, but the suppression was a fact, and a suppressed revelation about which nothing is known is a space into which everything can be projected. The mechanism had been created, inadvertently, by a decision that was, in itself, arguably reasonable, but whose consequences were not reasonable, whose consequences were the specific, uncontrollable, self-amplifying consequences of institutional silence about a subject on which the public demand for information was intense and growing. There is a specific kind of silence that produces more noise than speech. Not the silence of absence, the silence of a subject that no one has thought to discuss, that carries no weight of expectation, that exists in the spaces between conversations without anyone noticing its presence. That kind of silence is genuinely quiet. The silence of a known secret is different. The silence of a known secret is active. It is a silence that people press against, that they fill with their own projections, that they interpret as communication, even though no communication has been made. It is a silence that generates, in the people who are aware of it, the specific psychological pressure of unsatisfied curiosity, the pressure that the human mind relieves when it cannot be satisfied with accurate information, by generating plausible information, by inventing what it cannot know. The Vatican's silence about the Third Secret of Fatima from 1960, when John Duxent III read and did not publish it, till 2000, when Cardinal Ratzinger finally released it, was this second kind of silence. It was a silence that everyone knew about, a silence about a subject that millions of people cared intensely about, a silence that lasted 40 years. And the noise that 40 years of this kind of silence produced was, in its volume and its variety and its political consequences, one of the most significant bodies of religious misinformation generated in the 20th century, not fabricated by any single author, not distributed by any single institution, generated, collectively and continuously, by the specific mechanism of known secret silence, by the gap between what the public believed existed and what the public was allowed to know. The first significant wave of Third Secret speculation began in the early 1960s. Almost immediately after the year 1960 had passed, without the publication that Lucia's instructions had seemed to promise, the speculation was not random. It was shaped by the available information, by what was known about the first and second secrets, by the theological and political context of the early 1960s, and by the specific expectations that the Fatima tradition had generated over the preceding 4 decades. The second secret had spoken of wars, of Russia's errors spreading through the world, of persecutions of the Church, of nations being annihilated. The second secret had been dramatically confirmed in the minds of those who followed the Fatima tradition by the Second World War and the spread of Soviet communism. The third secret, whatever it contained, was by implication even more serious. If the second secret had been about a world war and the spread of an atheist ideology, the third secret was presumably about something worse. What could be worse than the Second World War? This question organized the speculation. The answers generated by the speculation in the early 1960s were, in their diversity and their intensity, a remarkable demonstration of what the human imagination produces when it is given a framework, the Fatima tradition, the prophetic vocabulary of Catholic apocalypticism, the Cold War anxiety about nuclear annihilation and a gap to fill. The third secret predicted a nuclear war. Specifically, it described the destruction of major cities by fire from the sky, imagery consistent with nuclear weapons, which had been available since 1945 and which the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had made terrifyingly present in the public consciousness. The third secret predicted a great apostasy, a falling away from the faith on a massive scale, possibly including a pope who would abandon Catholic doctrine. This version connected the third secret to the anxieties generated by the Second Vatican Council, which had opened in 1962, and which conservative Catholics viewed with varying degrees of alarm as a potential abandonment of traditional doctrine. The third secret predicted the assassination of a pope. This version was specific enough to generate a name. Some versions specified that it was the pope who would be in office in the years immediately ahead. Others were more general. The imagery of a pope dying violently resonated with the Catholic devotional tradition's emphasis on martyrdom and with the geopolitical context of the Cold War, in which the Church's leadership was a plausible target for Soviet hostility. The third secret predicted the end of the world. This version was the most extreme and the most theologically consistent with the logic of the Fatima tradition. If the first secret revealed hell, the second revealed the consequences of failing to heed the message. The third would logically reveal the ultimate consequence, the last judgment. None of these versions was the third secret. All of them were more dramatic than the third secret that was eventually published. And the gap between the speculation and the reality, the gap that the publication of 2000 would eventually reveal, was itself a demonstration of what 40 years of institutional silence does to public expectation. It inflates it, beyond any possible satisfaction. The mechanism of third secret speculation was not merely a popular phenomenon, not merely the product of ordinary Catholics filling a gap with their own anxieties and hopes. It was a literary and institutional phenomenon as well. In the 1960s and 1970s, a significant body of published material was produced specifically around the third secret books, pamphlets, articles, and eventually films that claimed to reveal or reconstruct the secret's content. Some of these were produced by people who genuinely believed they had access to reliable information about the text. Some were produced by people who were engaged in straightforward fabrication, using the Fatima tradition as a vehicle for their own theological or political agendas. Most were somewhere between these poles, products of people who had assembled fragments of real information, genuine speculation, and motivated interpretation into something that felt more authoritative than it was. The most influential of these texts was produced by a German writer named Neues Europa, which published in 1963 what it claimed was a text of the Third Secret, a text that described, among other things, a great chastisement of humanity, the destruction of nations, and specific apocalyptic imagery that drew on the Catholic prophetic tradition. The Neues Europa text was not the Third Secret. It was, as subsequent scholarship has established, a fabrication, a text produced by someone who had access to the Fatima tradition and the Catholic prophetic vocabulary, and who had assembled them into something that appeared to readers who wanted to believe it was authentic, to be the thing they were looking for. But it was widely circulated. It was reproduced in multiple languages. It was cited by subsequent authors as if it were genuine. And it established, in the minds of many people who encountered it, an expectation about the content of the Third Secret that would not be satisfied by the actual text when it was eventually published. Because the Neues Europa text was more dramatic than the actual Third Secret. And the actual Third Secret, when published in 2000, would be evaluated not against the reality of what it was, a vision, a symbolic sequence, a piece of devotional writing by a Portuguese nun, but against the expectations that 40 years of speculation had generated. And against those expectations, it would inevitably disappoint. The Vatican's management of the Third Secret during the decades of silence was not, as critics sometimes characterized it, a simple policy of deliberate suppression designed to prevent the faithful from knowing the truth. It was something more complex and, in certain respects, more institutionally rational. The Vatican was managing a document whose content it could not publicly defend without publishing it, and whose publication it had decided, for reasons that it declined to explain fully, to defer. This created a specific institutional problem. How do you maintain authority over a subject on which you are refusing to communicate? The answer the Vatican chose was a combination of partial disclosure and institutional assertion. Partial disclosure. Church officials made occasional statements about the Third Secret that confirmed its existence, hinted at its content without revealing it, and managed public expectations by suggesting that its content was more somber than urgent, that it was a text that required careful preparation for its reception rather than immediate publication. Institutional assertion. When specific fabricated versions of the Third Secret like the Neues Europa text gained wide circulation, Vatican officials denied that these were authentic, without providing the information that would have allowed people to assess the authenticity question for themselves. The denial was authoritative, but authority without information, in a context where the public demand for information is intense, tends to produce skepticism rather than deference. The Vatican was saying, trust us. And the people who most needed to hear that, the people most invested in the Fatima tradition, most anxious about the secret's content, most susceptible to the fabricated versions that were circulating, were precisely the people least inclined to trust an institution that had been sitting on a known secret for decades and declining to explain why. If the goal was to reduce speculation, the institutional management of the Third Secret appears to have failed. Not because the Vatican's decisions were wrong in themselves, there may have been good reasons for each individual decision that was made, but because the cumulative effect of those decisions was to transform a documented religious experience into a misinformation machine, a mechanism that generated false information faster than the institution could correct it, that created expectations it could never satisfy, that produced a body of speculation so extensive and so entrenched that the eventual truth, when released, was received not as a resolution but as a new source of controversy. The institution had not lied. It had been silent. The institution had not necessarily lied. It had been silent, and the silence had lied for it, more effectively than any deliberate deception could have managed. The specific version of Third Secret speculation that proved most consequential, the version that would shape the events of May 13th, 1981, and their aftermath, was the version that predicted the assassination of a pope. This version had been circulating since the early 1960s, drawing on the language of the Second Secret's reference to the Holy Father having much to suffer, and on the general logic of escalation that organized the speculation. If the Second Secret predicted a world war, the Third must predict something worse, and the worst thing that could happen to the Church was the death of its leader. The version that predicted a pope's assassination had specific currency in the Cold War context of the 1960s and 1970s. The Soviet Union had both the motive and the capability to attempt the assassination of the head of the Catholic Church, an institution whose political opposition to communism was well established and whose influence in the countries of Eastern Europe was a continuing source of Soviet concern. The KGB had surveillance and influence operations within the Vatican. The possibility of a Soviet-backed assassination attempt on a pope was not, in the Cold War intelligence environment, merely theoretical. And then, on May 13th, 1981, the 64th anniversary of the first Fatima apparition, Mehmet Ali Aka shot John Paul II in St. Peter's Square. The date was not a coincidence, or it was a coincidence. In the strict causal sense, there is no established evidence that Aka chose the date deliberately because of its Fatima significance. The date may have been chosen for operational reasons that had nothing to do with the Marian calendar, or it may have been chosen deliberately. The evidence does not conclusively establish either. But for the hundreds of millions of people who were aware of both the Fatima tradition and the date of the shooting, the coincidence was overwhelming. May 13th, the anniversary of Fatima, a pope shot in St. Peter's Square. Many people shaped by the Fatima framework. The Third Secret now seemed to have predicted this. The prediction appeared, to them, to have been right. The mechanism, which had been running for 60 years on speculation about what the Third Secret said, had just been given what appeared to be confirmation. The most powerful kind of confirmation available, an apparent fulfillment. The specific details of the shooting were, in the context of the Fatima tradition, almost unbearably resonant. John Paul II had taken office in 1978 as the first non-Italian pope in 4.5 centuries ago. From behind the Iron Curtain, from the country where the confrontation between the Catholic Church and Soviet communism was most intense and most personal, he was, from the perspective of the Fatima tradition, almost perfectly cast for the role that the Second Secret had described, the Holy Father who would have much to suffer. The Pope whose pontificate would be defined by the confrontation with Russia's errors. He had not yet consecrated Russia. He had not yet fulfilled the requirement of the Second Secret. He had, in fact, been Pope for less than 3 years, and now he had been shot, on the anniversary of Fatima, in the square that was the symbolic center of his institution, by a man whose connections to Soviet intelligence, to Bulgarian intelligence, to various other actors whose interests in the Pope's death were not immediately clear, would generate a decade of investigation and never be fully resolved. The Third Secret had predicted this, hadn't it? The question was rhetorical for the people who believed the prediction had been right, but it was a question that pointed toward a specific institutional consequence. If the Third Secret predicted a papal assassination attempt, and the assassination attempt had occurred, then the Third Secret was confirmed in the same way that the Second Secret had been confirmed by the Second World War. And if the Third Secret was confirmed, then everything else the Third Secret was supposed to contain, whatever beyond the assassination attempt the speculation had attributed to it, was also presumably accurate. The mechanism of confirmation was running on an event whose connection to the prophecy was, at minimum, one of timing rather than demonstrated causal relationship. But timing, in the context of prophetic tradition, is not a minor thing. It is the primary form that confirmation takes. The thing happened on the right date. That is sufficient. That has always been sufficient. John Paul II's response to the shooting, his interpretation of it within the Fatima framework, was not the private piety of a recovering patient reaching for familiar comfort. It was a public theological statement with significant institutional consequences. He read the Third Secret in the hospital. He concluded that it described what had happened to him. He traveled to Fatima in 1982 and placed the bullet in the crown of the statue. He performed the consecration of Russia in 1984. Each of these acts was a public act, an act performed in front of witnesses, reported in the press, incorporated into the official narrative of his pontificate and of the Fatima tradition. And each of these acts confirmed, for the hundreds of millions of people who were watching, that the Third Secret had predicted the assassination attempt, that the Fatima tradition was accurate, and that the institutional acts John Paul II was performing, the pilgrimage, the consecration, were the appropriate responses to what the prophecy had specified, whether or not he meant to validate every layer of the Fatima tradition. He was unmistakably validating its relevance to his own survival. This was the highest possible institutional endorsement of the Fatima tradition, higher than any official church statement, higher than any theological investigation, higher than any document in the Vatican archives. The Pope, who had been shot on May 13th, was saying, "This was predicted. I was saved because of Fatima, and I am now fulfilling what Fatima requires." And the speculation about what the Third Secret said, the speculation that had been running since 1960, that had generated fabricated texts and apocalyptic predictions and Cold War conspiracy theories, this speculation did not end with John Paul II's implicit confirmation. It intensified, because John Paul II had not published the Third Secret. He had confirmed that the Third Secret was relevant to what had happened to him. He had performed the acts that the Second Secret required, but he had not shown anyone what the Third Secret said, which meant the gap was still there, and the mechanism was running with more fuel than it had ever had. Because now the Pope himself was part of the story. The man who shot John Paul II. He was not, at least on the surface, an obviously coherent political instrument. He was Mehmet Ali Ağa, a Turkish citizen, born in 1958 inches, the village of Yeşiltepe, in the Malatya province of eastern Anatolia, a region that had produced, in the decades before Ağa's birth, the specific combination of rural poverty, political volatility, and institutional neglect that tends to generate men whose violence is available for purchase by whoever offers the most compelling framework for it. He had been convicted in Turkey in 1979 for the murder of Abdi İpekçi, the editor-in-chief of the Turkish newspaper Milliyet, one of the country's most prominent liberal journalists. He had escaped from prison before sentencing. He had sent a letter to Milliyet, threatening to kill the Pope if the planned papal visit to Turkey proceeded. The visit proceeded. Ağa was not apprehended. He traveled to Western Europe on forged documents. He arrived in Rome in the spring of 1981. He was 23 years old. He had been in Italy for weeks before the shooting, living in a hotel room, moving through a city that had no particular reason to know who he was. On May 13th, he walked into St. Peter's Square, where the Pope's Wednesday audience was being held, where tens of thousands of pilgrims and tourists had gathered in the open space before the basilica and stood in the crowd, and waited. And when the Pope-mobile came close enough, he fired. He was arrested immediately, tackled by bystanders and security personnel before he could escape. He did not resist. He was taken into Italian custody, tried, convicted of attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison. He was not, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, obviously connected to anything larger than himself. He was a Turkish national with a criminal history and a documented willingness to threaten and commit political violence. He was in the specific taxonomy of Cold War security analysis, a lone actor of the kind that Western Europe had been producing with uncomfortable regularity throughout the 1970s, the decade of the Red Brigades in Italy, of the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany, of political violence as a form of theatrical communication that had become the 1981. So common a feature of the European political landscape that the question of what any specific act meant was often secondary to the question of who had organized it. The question of who had organized the attempt on John Paul II's life would occupy Italian prosecutors, intelligence agencies, journalists, historians, and the Vatican itself for the next decade. It would not be conclusively answered. And the inconclusiveness of the answer, the specific, maddening inability to establish beyond reasonable doubt who had given Mehmet Ali Aka his instructions and his money and his weapons, would become, in the context of the Fatima tradition, not a failure of investigation but a confirmation of prophecy. Because if the Third Secret had predicted that the Pope would be shot, and the Pope had been shot, then the failure to identify the ultimate power behind the shooting was consistent with the prophetic framework rather than contradictory to it. The mystery of the shooter was absorbed by the mystery of the secret. The mechanism did not require resolution. It required resonance. The investigation that followed the shooting of May 13th, 1981, was one of the most extensive, most politically sensitive, and most ultimately inconclusive investigations in the history of post-war European crime. The surface facts were not disputed. Aka had fired the shots. Aka had been a member of a Turkish far-right organization called the Grey Wolves before his conviction for the İpekçi murder. Aka had escaped from a Turkish military prison under circumstances that suggested, at minimum, official indifference to his continued incarceration. Aka had traveled through Bulgaria before arriving in Italy, and had been in contact during that period with members of a Bulgarian intelligence network. The contested question was what these surface facts connected to. The Italian investigating magistrate who took on the case in 1982, Ilario Martella, a judge of the Rome Court of Assizes who spent 3 years assembling evidence, concluded that Aka had been recruited and directed by the Bulgarian intelligence service, the Državna Sigurnost, which was at that time effectively a subsidiary of the Soviet KGB. The assassination attempt, in Martella's reconstruction, was a KGB operation, an attempt by the Soviet intelligence apparatus to eliminate the head of the Catholic Church, whose influence in Poland was a direct and immediate threat to Soviet control of Eastern Europe. The theory was coherent. It was supported by circumstantial evidence, Aka's contacts in Bulgaria, payments that could be traced to Bulgarian sources, the testimony of a Bulgarian intelligence defector who claimed to have knowledge of a Soviet operation targeting the Pope. It was contested by counter-evidence. The defector's testimony was unreliable in ways that the prosecution could not fully explain. The financial trail, which Martella's team had followed with considerable effort, disappeared at the point where it would have had to lead to Soviet sources. The Bulgarian defendants who had tried alongside Aka in the 1986 trial were acquitted not because the jury concluded they were innocent, but because the evidence, while suggestive, did not meet the standard required for conviction. Aka himself was spectacularly unhelpful. His statements about the conspiracy ranged from plausible to delusional. He claimed Bulgarian direction. He claimed KGB direction. He claimed to be acting on his own. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. He claimed that the Fatima prophecy required that he shoot the Pope. He claimed that his mission had been organized by a network whose members he named, then unnamed, then named differently. The Italian courts spent years trying to establish what portion of Acca's statements corresponded to reality and what portion was strategic manipulation, fantasy, or the product of whatever psychological process had produced a man capable of his history. They did not fully succeed. What emerged from the investigation, by the time Italian courts formally closed the case in the early 1990s, was something less than a proven Soviet conspiracy and something more than a lone gunman. There was a network. The network had Bulgarian elements. Whether the Bulgarians were acting under Soviet direction or on their own initiative, or for reasons that neither the Soviets nor the Bulgarians have ever fully disclosed, this question remained, and remains, unresolved. The specific gap in the investigation, the point where the evidence ran out, where the trail led to a wall behind which the Soviet intelligence apparatus sat in the silence of an institution that had destroyed its own records and survived its own collapse, became, in the Fatima tradition, a theological space, a space that the prophecy was already equipped to fill. The Second Secret had spoken of Russia spreading its errors through the world, provoking wars and persecutions of the Church. The attempted assassination of the Pope by an agent connected to Soviet-aligned intelligence was, in the interpretive framework of the Fatima tradition, not merely a political crime. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy. It was the proof that the errors Lucia had warned about in the 1940s, the errors that the consecration of Russia was supposed to prevent, had reached their logical extreme. For many readers of Fatima, the attempted assassination looked like the geopolitical logic of the Second Secret made concrete. The Pope had survived because Our Lady had deflected the bullet, because the Third Secret had predicted it, because the mechanism of Fatima was now running in real time, with a living Pope as its central figure, and a geopolitical conflict as its prophetic context. John Paul II's interpretation of what had happened to him on May 13th, 1981 was developed gradually, in the specific way that significant personal experiences are developed by people who have the intellectual resources to process them within a sophisticated framework. He was not, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, producing theological statements. He was in surgery. He was in recovery. He was, for the first weeks after May 13th, engaged in the more fundamental work of surviving. But as he recovered, and the recovery was, by the medical accounts, genuinely remarkable. The bullet that passed through his abdomen missed his central aorta by millimeters, in a trajectory that the Pope's personal secretary would later describe with the specific language of providential intervention. As impossible to explain without reference to divine protection, he began to process what had happened within the framework that his entire life had prepared him for. Karol Wojtyła had grown up in a Poland where Catholicism was not merely a religious identity but a form of civilizational survival, the institutional continuity of a nation that had been, for the century and a half before his birth, partitioned, occupied, and systematically denied its political existence by the empires that surrounded it. He had spent the Nazi occupation of Poland working in a chemical factory and studying secretly in an underground seminary. He had spent the Cold War as a bishop, and then archbishop, and then cardinal in a country where the Church's relationship with the communist state was a continuous negotiation of the specific terms under which Catholic institutional existence would be permitted. He was, in other words, a man who understood at a level of personal and historical experience that most theologians only encounter abstractly the relationship between religious faith and political power, between the claims of institutional authority and the claims of transcendent meaning. And within this framework, the interpretation that suggested itself on May 13th, 1981, was not a naive, reaching for comfort. It appears to have been, for John Paul II, more than a moment of private comfort. It became a considered theological reading of the event, by a man who had the theological and political sophistication to evaluate it. He had been shot on the anniversary of Fatima. The Fatima tradition spoke of the Holy Father suffering. The Third Secret, which he had not yet read, had been generating speculation for decades that its content included a vision of papal violence. He was a pope from Poland, from the country that the Second Secret had identified as the front line of the conflict between the Church and Russia's errors. The coincidences were, for him, too specific to ignore. He asked to read the Third Secret. His personal secretary, Stanisław Divis, the man who had been sitting beside him in the Pope-mobile when the shots were fired, who had cradled the Pope in his arms as the ambulance was called, who had remained with him through the hours of surgery, retrieved the text from the Vatican's secret archives and brought it to the Gemelli Polyclinic. John Paul II read it. What happened next is, in the strict historical sense, unknown. The accounts of what John Paul II said and did after reading the Third Secret in the hospital are second-hand, filtered through the recollections of witnesses who were present in a state of considerable emotional intensity and who recorded those recollections years later, after subsequent events had shaped what seemed most significant to remember. Jivish's account, given in various interviews and eventually published in his memoir, describes the Pope reading the text, becoming absorbed in it, and expressing something, a statement, a response, a recognition whose content Ziwisz summarizes without quoting directly as the Pope's conclusion that the text described what had happened to him. Cardinal Ratzinger's later account confirms the general shape of this response without providing more detail. What is documented not by recollection but by subsequent public action is what John Paul II did in response to reading the Third Secret. He decided, when he recovered, to go to Fatima, not to the Vatican, not to his desk in the Apostolic Palace, not to the ordinary work of his pontificate, to Fatima, on May 13th, 1982. Exactly 1 year after the shooting, he arrived in the town in central Portugal, where 3 children had seen a woman in white above an oak tree 65 years earlier. He carried something, the bullet that had been removed from his body. The ceremony of May 13th, Il Devindicindva at Fatima, was, in its symbolic construction, one of the most carefully composed public acts of John Paul II's pontificate, and a pontificate that understood public symbolism with exceptional sophistication. He arrived at the shrine in the afternoon. He processed through the crowd, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across the Catholic world. People who had come to see the man who had survived May 13th returned to the place that May 13th had made theologically significant for all of them. He prayed at the Chapel of the Apparitions, the small structure built on the site of the Cova da Iria, on the ground where the 3 children had stood in 1917. He met Lucia Santos. She was 75 years old. She had been a Carmelite nun at the Coimbra Monastery for nearly 30 years. She had spent those 30 years in the specific combination of prayer, correspondence, and institutional negotiation that her role as the primary surviving witness of the Fatima apparitions required. She had been writing to popes and cardinals for decades about the consecration requirement. She had been saying, repeatedly and specifically, that the requirement had not yet been fulfilled. The meeting between John Paul II and Lucia Santos at Fatima in May 1982 was not a private spiritual encounter. It was a public event that was photographed, filmed, reported, and analyzed. The images of the Pope and the old nun, the man who had survived the assassination attempt, and the woman who was the last living link to the apparitions that had predicted it, became some of the most widely distributed religious images of the late 20th century. What they said to each other privately was not reported. What was reported was the public act that followed. John Paul II took the bullet, the deformed piece of lead that had been extracted from his abdomen by the surgeons at the Gemelli Polyclinic, and placed it in the crown of the statue of Our Lady of Fatima. The crown of the statue had been made in 1946 from the jewelry donated by Portuguese women to celebrate the consecration of Portugal to the Immaculate Heart. It was already a layered object, a construction of accumulated devotion, a physical representation of the relationship between the Fatima tradition and its believers. Adding the bullet that had been removed from the Pope's body was an act of meaning-making so direct, so physically specific, so viscerally concrete that it required no interpretation, the Pope was saying, with his body and the evidence of the violence done to it. The Pope was saying, as clearly as symbolic action could say it, that he believed Fatima had saved him, that he believed the apparition's protection had intervened between the bullet and its intended outcome, that the mechanism of the prophecy had operated in real time. On May 13th, Ichenjo Baibashi in St. Peter's Square, and had produced the specific outcome, the Pope's survival, that the mechanism required. The bullet was now part of the crown. The violence was now part of the devotion. The attempted assassination was now, officially and irreversibly, part of the Fatima story. What John Paul II could not yet say publicly because the third secret was still sealed was what, specifically, the third secret had told him about all of this. He had read it. He had interpreted it as describing his own experience. He had acted on that interpretation in the most public way possible. But he had not shown anyone what the text said. The gap was still there, and the gap was now occupied by something more powerful than speculation. It was occupied by the Pope's implicit endorsement of the speculation, because the Pope had placed the bullet in the crown. The Pope had returned to Fatima on the anniversary of the shooting. The Pope had met with Lucia Santos, and the Pope had not published the third secret. Every one of these acts communicated that the third secret was relevant to what had happened. Every one of them suggested that the third secret contained something significant enough to have shaped the Pope's response to being shot. Every one of them said, without saying, the secret matters. The secret is about this, but not what the secret was. The mechanism was running at its highest pitch. A Pope had been shot on the anniversary of Fatima. The Pope had survived. The Pope had gone to Fatima. The Pope had put the bullet in the crown, and the Pope was still not showing anyone what the third secret said. The expectation that had been building since 1960 was now supported by the most compelling possible evidence, the evidence of a living man's survival of an assassination attempt, and still the gap was not filled. What could the third secret possibly say that was so important, so significant, so dangerous or sacred or difficult that even this, even the bullet, even the crown, even May 13th, 1981 was not sufficient reason to publish it? The question was, the 1982, the central question of the Fatima tradition. And it would remain the central question for another 18 years. The consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, performed by John Paul II on March 25th. Was the most significant institutional act of the Fatima tradition in the 20th century and also, in its aftermath, one of the most contested. The background to the consecration of 1984 was a long institutional history that the Church had been managing with diminishing success since the 1940s. Lucia had specified the terms of the required consecration with a precision that the Church found difficult to satisfy, while simultaneously maintaining the operational and diplomatic flexibility that the Cold War required. The requirement the Pope, in union with all the bishops of the world, explicitly naming Russia created a specific institutional problem. Explicitly naming Russia in a solemn liturgical act at the height of the Cold War, was a statement of ecclesiastical opposition to the Soviet state that carried political consequences for every Catholic institution operating in the Soviet sphere. For the ecumenical dialogues that the Vatican had been conducting with the Russian Orthodox Church, and for the broader diplomatic strategy of Ostpolitik that Paul VI had pursued since the 1960s. The Fatima devotees who pressed for the consecration were, in the specific terms of this analysis, asking the Church to make a public theological statement that would function as a political provocation in a geopolitical context where the Church had significant institutional interests on both sides of the question. John Paul II was, uniquely among the popes who had faced this problem, a man who had personal and national reasons to treat the Fatima requirement as a priority rather than an inconvenience. He was Polish. He had been shot, apparently by agents connected to Soviet intelligence. On the anniversary of Fatima, he had read the Third Secret. He had placed the bullet in the crown. He was not, in other words, a pope who needed to be convinced that the Fatima tradition was relevant. The consecration he performed on March 25th, 1984 was done in St. Peter's Square, in the presence of the statue of Our Lady of Fatima that had been brought from Portugal for the occasion. It was performed in union with letters sent to the bishops of the world, letters that requested that the bishops join in the act, though the degree of actual episcopal participation was, in practice, uneven. It did not explicitly name Russia. The text of the act referred to those peoples for whom you yourself are awaiting our act of consecration and entrustment language that was understood by Fatima devotees as a coded reference to Russia while maintaining the diplomatic ambiguity that the institutional situation required. Lucia Santos, who had consistently said that previous consecrations were insufficient, subsequently confirmed in a letter written to a Carmelite priest in August 1989 that the consecration of 1984 had fulfilled the requirements specified by the Lady of Fatima. The confirmation was qualified, asked, and analyzed by Fatima devotees with the specific intensity that the consecration question had generated. Some accepted it as definitive. Others argued that the lack of explicit naming of Russia meant the consecration was still technically insufficient, and that Lucia's confirmation had been given under institutional pressure or was itself in need of interpretation. The dispute has never been fully resolved. What was not disputed was the subsequent event. The Soviet Union began to collapse in 1989. The process was not sudden. It had been building for decades in the structural economic stagnation that had been visible to serious analysts of the Soviet system since the 1970s. In the military overextension of the Afghanistan campaign that had begun in 1979 and was consuming resources and lives with no strategic resolution in sight. In the political dynamics of a system that had suppressed genuine institutional feedback for so long that its leadership had no accurate information about the scale of the problems it was facing. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika. Openness and restructuring were an attempt to address these structural problems without dismantling the system that had produced them. They succeeded in accelerating the collapse rather than preventing it. The reforms created space for expression that the system could not absorb. The expression produced demands that the system could not meet. The demands produced confrontations that the system could not survive. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, which had been the most significant example of the Church's political role in the confrontation with Soviet communism, and which had direct personal connections to John Paul II, had been leading this process since 1980. In 1989, in negotiations with the Polish Communist government that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier, Solidarity achieved partially free elections. The Communists lost. Poland's transition had begun. The process spread. Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. By the end of 1989, Every communist government in Eastern Europe had collapsed or was collapsing, in a sequence so rapid and so comprehensive that the intelligence analysts who had been predicting the slow erosion of Soviet power found themselves describing something that was happening faster than their models had allowed. The Soviet Union itself followed. The formal dissolution was declared on December 25th. From the perspective of the Fatima tradition, the chronology was devastating in its clarity. March 25th, 1984. John Paul II consecrates Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. August 1989. Russia confirms that the consecration was valid. 1989. 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. The Second Secret had promised that if Russia was consecrated, Russia would be converted and a period of peace would be granted to the world. The consecration had been performed. The confirmation had been given. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The sequence was, in the interpretive framework of the Fatima tradition, not a coincidence. It was a fulfillment for those already invested in the Fatima narrative. This looked like spectacular confirmation. The institution had finally performed the required act. The required act had produced the promised result. The mechanism of the Fatima tradition, which had been running since 1917, which had survived the silence about the Third Secret, which had been confirmed by the assassination attempt of 1981, which had been institutionally endorsed by John Paul II's pilgrimage, and the bullet in the crown had delivered on its promise. The problem with this reading of the Soviet collapse was not that it was emotionally or theologically unsatisfying. It was that it was structurally identical to every other prophetic fulfillment the series has examined. A prophecy is made. The prophecy is vague enough to be compatible with multiple outcomes. An outcome occurs that is compatible with the prophecy. The prophecy is declared fulfilled. The process of prophetic fulfillment does not require that the prophecy cause the outcome. It requires only that the outcome is compatible with the prophecy's description, that the prophecy can be read after the fact as having described what happened. The Second Secret's promise, consecrate Russia. Russia will be converted and peace will follow, was compatible with the Soviet collapse. The specific mechanism of the consecration was not connected to the specific mechanism of the collapse by any causal chain that historians or political scientists have established. The collapse had its causes: the structural failures of the Soviet economy, the political dynamics of Gorbachev's reforms, the sustained pressure of the American military buildup, the specific vulnerabilities of an authoritarian system, and none of these causes included a liturgical act performed in St. Peter's Square. But the promise did not need to be causal. It needed to be compatible. And compatible it was. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The promise had said Russia would be converted. The promise was fulfilled. In the minds of the hundreds of millions of people for whom the Fatima tradition organized the meaning of the 20th century's most significant geopolitical events, this fulfillment was not a matter of interpretation. It was a fact. The sequence had happened. The promise had been kept. What the fulfillment of the Second Secret did to the Third Secret was not, as one might expect, resolve the question of what the Third Secret said. It intensified it, because the Second Secret had been about wars in Russia and the survival of the church, events that were, in their political dimension, the most significant events of the 20th century. These events had been predicted. They had occurred. The prediction had been accurate, which meant that the Third Secret, the part that was still sealed, the part that had been too serious to publish in 1960, the part that John Paul II had read in the hospital and described as his destiny, this secret, whose content was still unknown, existed in a prophetic context that had just been dramatically validated. If the second secret was right about the Second World War, about the spread of Soviet communism, about the assassination attempt of 1981, about the consecration and the collapse, what was the third secret right about? What was the secret that had survived all of this? What had the figure told the 10-year-old girl in the field at Kova Dairia that was so significant, so difficult, so carefully managed by the Vatican for 80 years, that even the fulfillment of the second secret in the most spectacular fashion imaginable had not been considered sufficient justification for its publication? The question was more urgent in 1992 than it had been in 1960, because the framework within which it was asked was more credibly prophetic, because the mechanism had produced results, and the mechanism kept running. The figure of Mehmet Ali Aka did not disappear from the story after his conviction. He remained in Italian prison for nearly 2 decades, a source of continuing fascination and confusion, a man whose testimony about what he had done and why he had done it shifted with such frequency and such apparent cynicism that the specific question of what he actually believed about the Fatima tradition became, in itself, a kind of theological test case. John Paul II visited Aka in prison in December 1983. 18 months after the shooting. The visit lasted approximately 20 minutes. It was private, there was no official record of what was said. But the photographs taken through the cell door showed the Pope sitting close to the man who had shot him, speaking to him, holding his hand. Aja appeared. In the images, attentive and uncertain, the specific expression of a person who has been prepared for one kind of encounter and finds himself in another. John Paul II had already said publicly that he forgave Aka. The prison visit was not, primarily, a pastoral act toward a man in need, though it was that too. It was a public theological statement. The Pope who had been shot had gone to visit the man who had shot him, and had done so in private, without the cameras, without a press conference, without the institutional apparatus of managed public communication. The visit was photographed through the cell door because the Pope had not forbidden photography, but he had not staged it for photography either. What the Pope had done was perform a private act of reconciliation that was nonetheless a public statement of what the Fatima tradition required, because the Fatima tradition required that the response to violence be prayer and sacrifice and forgiveness, not vengeance, because the figure in 1917 had asked for prayer for sinners, because John Paul II understood that the man sitting across from him in the Roman prison was, in the Fatima framework, as much a part of the story as the Pope himself, the instrument of the attempted assassination, a man whose trigger finger had put the bullet in the crown. Aka asked John Paul II, according to the accounts that emerged later from Ziwis, who was present, why he had survived. He had aimed carefully. He was a trained marksman. The shot that should have been fatal had not been fatal. Why had he survived? John Paul II told him, Our Lady of Fatima, Aka had been prepared, in his various statements before and after the prison visit, to discuss the Fatima connection. He had raised it himself, had claimed at various points that his mission was connected to the Fatima prophecy, that he understood himself to be part of a prophetic script. Whether this was genuine theological conviction, strategic manipulation of the narrative, or a reflection of his particular psychological condition was impossible to establish. But the Pope's answer, Our Lady of Fatima, was consistent. It was the answer he had been giving since the hospital. It was the answer he would continue to give. And Aka's subsequent public statements, which became increasingly theatrical and increasingly focused on the Fatima connection as the years passed, were shaped by this answer in ways that are difficult to disentangle from the man's obvious capacity for strategic self-presentation. He told Italian journalists that he was Jesus Christ reincarnated and that the third secret was about him. He told Turkish journalists that the real conspiracy behind the assassination attempt involved the Vatican itself, that the shooting had been organized by internal church forces who wanted to use the Fatima connection for institutional purposes. He told a German magazine that the Bulgarian connection was real, but the Soviet direction was not, that the shooting had been organized by a Bulgarian intelligence officer acting independently of Moscow. He told a French documentarian that he had never fully understood who had organized his mission. He told an American interviewer that he had been chosen for the task because of his prior assassination, the murder of Ipekci, which had demonstrated to whoever was directing him that he was capable of completing an assignment. Every statement contradicted at least one previous statement. Every statement was reported. Every statement added to the mechanism, because a man who had shot the Pope and survived, who was sitting in an Italian prison talking about Fatima and Jesus and the KGB and internal Vatican conspiracies, was exactly the kind of figure that the mechanism of the Third Secret required. Not a solved mystery, an unsolved one. Not a closed story, an open one. The kind of story that, in the specific grammar of prophetic misinformation, never ends because its ending would require a resolution that the mechanism is structurally designed to prevent. By the mid-1990s, John Paul II had been Pope for nearly 2 decades. He had survived the assassination attempt. He had performed the consecration of Russia. He had witnessed the Soviet collapse. He had visited Archon prison. He had placed the bullet in the crown, and the Third Secret was still sealed. The men who had originally read and sealed it, John the 23rd and Paul VI, were dead. The man who is now Pope had read it in the most dramatic possible circumstances in a hospital bed, recovering from an assassination attempt, and had interpreted it as describing his own experience. The question of when and whether to publish had been present in every major decision of John Paul II's pontificate that touched on the Fatima tradition. He had been asked about it repeatedly. He had deflected repeatedly. He had suggested, in the careful language of a man who understood the consequences of his words on this subject, that the decision would be made at the appropriate time. What constituted the appropriate time was never specified. The mechanism of uncertainty kept running. But by the late 1990s, a new urgency had entered the question. The millennium was approaching. The year 2000, a date that carried, in the Catholic tradition, the specific symbolic weight of the Jubilee year, of renewal and forgiveness, and the celebration of 2,000 years of Christian history was the date that John Paul II had chosen as the focal point of his pontificate's culmination. And the Third Secret, the sealed text that had been sitting in the Vatican archives since the 1950s, that had been generating speculation for 40 years, that had been implicitly confirmed as relevant by every public act the Pope had performed in response to the events of May 13th, 1981. The Third Secret was, by any measure, unfinished business. The millennium was coming. The question was coming with it, and the mechanism was about to deliver, after 40 years of operation, its most consequential output, the answer that would not answer, the revelation that would require, before it could be received, an act of interpretation so extensive, so carefully constructed, so institutionally managed that the interpretation itself would become the new subject of the speculation it was intended to end. But that is the story of the next act. What this act has established is the specific structure of the mechanism that produced the answer, not a conspiracy to deceive, not a simple suppression of inconvenient truth, but a layered institutional response to an event that the institution could not fully control, a response in which each individual decision was defensible, in which each individual act served a genuine purpose, and in which the cumulative effect was a body of misinformation more powerful, more durable, and more resistant to correction than any deliberate deception could have produced. The bullet was in the crown. The Pope had survived. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Third Secret was still sealed, and the mechanism was running toward 2000, toward the answer that would not answer, toward the revelation that would intensify the speculation it was supposed to end. The announcement came on June 26th. L'ancien Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the Vatican's Secretary of State, stood before the press corps assembled in the Holy See's press office and informed the world that the Vatican was publishing the Third Secret of Fatima. The text would be released the same day, a theological commentary, prepared by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The man who held the position once held by the Inquisition would accompany the text and provide the institutional interpretation that the Vatican considered essential to receiving it correctly. The moment had been building for 40 years. The sealed envelope, the locked safe, the death dates, the speculation that had accumulated through 2 popes who refused to publish, through an assassination attempt that had elevated the stakes to the level of lived experience, through the Soviet collapse that had retrospectively confirmed the Second Secret's prophetic framework, through the Jubilee year that John Paul II had chosen as the culmination of a pontificate that the Fatima tradition had marked, from the moment of the bullet in 1981, as prophetically significant. This was the moment. The answer was here. Reporters took notes. Cameras recorded. The text was distributed. And within hours of its release, it was clear that the publication had not resolved the question it was meant to answer. It had, with a precision that the mechanism of the Fatima tradition could hardly have improved on if it had designed the outcome deliberately, made the question more interesting. The text itself was brief. The Third Secret, as published by the Vatican, was a vision, not a verbal message, not a set of predictions in the form of words. A visual scene, described by Lucia Santos in her own hand, in a letter written at the request of her bishop in January 1944, in the specific language of a woman who had been asked to record what she had witnessed in July 1917 and who was, at the time of writing, a Carmelite novice trained in a tradition of visionary description that had been producing such documents for centuries. The vision, as Lucia described it, showed a figure in white identified as the Holy Father climbing a steep mountain toward a large cross at the summit, walking through a half-ruined city, passing the corpses of bishops and priests and lay people, falling apparently dead at the foot of the cross, and being shot by a group of soldiers whose bullets and arrows were deflected by 2 angels who gathered the blood of the martyrs and the Pope in crystal goblets and used them to sprinkle the souls of those approaching God. It was, in its imagery, recognizably consistent with the visionary vocabulary of Catholic mystical tradition: the steep mountain, the ruined city, the angels, the blood, the cross. It was the kind of image that people trained in the interpretation of Catholic mystical literature could situate within a known tradition: the suffering of the Church, the martyrdom of the faithful, the ultimate victory of divine grace over temporal violence. It was also, and this was the detail that every observer noted immediately, a text that did not contain the specific elements that 40 years of speculation had attributed to it. It did not predict the end of the world. It did not reveal the date of the apocalypse. It did not identify specific nations or political systems as instruments of divine punishment. It did not contain the secret knowledge about doctrinal crisis within the Church, the apostasy, the crisis of faith, the internal betrayal that the most elaborate of the Fatima speculations had attributed to it. It was, as Cardinal Ratzinger's theological commentary carefully argued, a vision of the 20th century's martyrdom of Christians, a prophetic image of the suffering of the Church under totalitarian regimes, culminating in the attempted assassination of May 13th, which the commentary identified as the central fulfillment of the vision's imagery. The white-clothed figure falling under the soldiers' fire was John Paul II. The ruined city was the landscape of ideological persecution. The cross at the summit was the ultimate horizon of Christian witness. The bullet that had not killed the Pope, the bullet now embedded in the crown at Fatima, was the angel's intervention that the vision had depicted. It was a coherent reading. It was as a piece of theological interpretation. Genuinely sophisticated, Ratzinger was one of the most intellectually formidable theologians of the 20th century. And the commentary he produced was not a public relations document pretending to be theology. It was a serious engagement with a visionary tradition, with the hermeneutics of prophetic literature, and with the specific relationship between the text and the events it was being asked to explain. It was also exactly the kind of reading the mechanism of the Fatima tradition had been predicting, with remarkable accuracy, would be produced when The Secret was finally published. The critics appeared within days. They were not, as the Vatican might have preferred, fringe figures, conspiracy theorists operating from self-published newsletters, amateur theologians with private grudges against the institutional church. The most significant critics were people with established credentials in the Fatima tradition itself, scholars who had spent careers studying the apparitions, priests and lay people whose devotion to Our Lady of Fatima was not in question, individuals whose objections carried the specific weight of insider knowledge rather than external skepticism. Their objection had a single, focused form. The text published on June 26, 2000 was too short. This was not a metaphorical criticism. It was a literal one. The vision of the white-clad figure and the ruined city and the angels with the crystal goblets occupied. In the handwritten original, a single sheet of paper Lucia's need. Small script filling the page in the careful way of someone who has been asked to transcribe an important document. A handwritten facsimile was included in the Vatican's publication. The critics, most prominently Father Nicholas Gruner, the founder of the Fatima Center, who had built a substantial following around the argument that the consecration of Russia remained unfulfilled, and the Italian priest and Fatima scholar Father Stefano Manelli, and a number of other figures pointed to testimony they claimed established that the Third Secret was not one page but several. They cited the account of Cardinal Ottaviani's 1967 press conference, in which Ottaviani had described reading a document of approximately 25 lines. They cited accounts suggesting that the Third Secret contained, in addition to or separate from the vision, an explanatory verbal text, a message in words attributed to the figure of the lady. Not merely a visual scene described in Lucia's own words. The vision that the Vatican had published was approximately 62 lines in Lucia's handwriting, by word count, by line count, by the accounts of those who had handled the document before its publication. The published text was consistent with a physical description of what the Vatican archives contained, but the verbal message, if there was a verbal message, was not there. The critics argued that there were two components to the Third Secret: the vision, which the Vatican had published, and a separate text in which Lucia recorded the words that the lady had spoken in connection with the vision. This verbal text, the interpretive key to the vision, the words that gave the images their specific prophetic meaning, had not been published. The Vatican said there was no such text. The critics said the Vatican was lying. The debate that followed had the specific quality of a debate in which both sides have genuine evidence for their position and neither side can produce evidence of the kind that would settle the question, because the evidence that would settle it was a document that one side said existed and the other side said did not. And the document was, either way, inside the Vatican. Sister Lucia Santos was, at this point, 93 years old. She had been a Carmelite nun in Coimbra for more than 50 years. She had spent those 50 years as the living institutional resource through which the Vatican managed the Fatima tradition, the woman whose testimony, whose correspondence, whose interpretations and confirmations provided the human bridge between the apparitions of 1917 and the institutional claims of the late 20th century. She was also, by the late 1990s, physically frail and institutionally managed in ways that made independent verification of her views difficult. The Carmelite monastery in Coimbra was not a prison. Sister Lucia was not incarcerated, but the conditions of her life, the enclosure of the monastery, the supervision of her correspondence by her superiors, the institutional interests of the Church in managing what the primary witness to the most significant private revelation in Catholic history said to the public meant that her access to the outside world was mediated by the institution that had the most significant stake in how her testimony was received. She had confirmed the consecration of 1,984 inches a letter. She had not, before the publication of the Third Secret, confirmed that the published text was complete. After the publication, she gave an interview conducted in the presence of Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, the then Secretary of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who visited her at the Coimbra Monastery in November 2001 inches, which she confirmed that the published text was the complete Third Secret, that there was no additional verbal message, and that the vision as published was the entirety of what she had recorded in 1944. Bertone published an account of this interview in a book released in 2007, The Last Secret of Fatima, in which he described Sister Lucia's confirmation and argued that the critics of the publication were pursuing a theory that the witness herself had repudiated. The critics responded that the interview had taken place under conditions the presence of a senior Vatican official, the enclosed setting of the monastery, the 93-year-old woman's documented physical and cognitive fragility that could not guarantee its reliability as independent testimony. They were not, in making this response, necessarily wrong to note the conditions. They were also, in using the conditions to dismiss the testimony entirely, doing exactly what the mechanism of the Fatima tradition required them to do. Because the mechanism of the Fatima tradition does not operate by producing resolution. It operates by producing the appearance of resolution followed by a new reason why the resolution is inadequate. The consecration of 1,984 was confirmed by Lucia, but the confirmation was given under institutional pressure. A Third Secret was published in 2000, but the publication was incomplete. The publication was confirmed as complete by Lucia in 2001, but the confirmation was given in the presence of a Vatican official. Every resolution generated a new critique. Every answer required a new question. The specific critique that emerged from the publication, the claim that a verbal message existed separately from the published vision, was not merely a product of bad faith. It was grounded in genuine ambiguities in the historical record. The most significant of these ambiguities was a statement made by Archbishop Loris Capovilla, who had been the personal secretary of Pope John XXIII and who had, in that capacity, read the Third Secret when it arrived at the Vatican in 1957. In a 2007 interview with Italian journalist Solideo Paolini, Capovilla confirmed something that Paolini had been investigating for years, that there were two envelopes, or more precisely, that the Third Secret had been housed in two different locations within the Vatican's archival system, and that both locations had been used by different people who had read the document. The document that had been read by John XXIII and stored in a particular safe in his private apartments was not, in Capovilla's account, in the same location as the envelope that Cardinal Ottaviani later described as being in the Holy Office. Whether these were two components of a single document stored separately, two different documents, or a single document that had been moved, and the record of its movement was creating the appearance of two versions. This was not clear from Capovilla's account. Cardinal Bertone, in his 2007 book, disputed Paolini's interpretation of Capovilla's statements and argued that the archival evidence supported a single document with a single location history. Capovilla, who was 92 years old at the time and whose statements were being passed with the specific intensity that the Fatima tradition generated, gave subsequent interviews in which his account shifted in ways that his interviewers attributed to different causes, some saying he had clarified, some saying he had been pressured to retract. The ambiguity was not resolved. It remains unresolved. The question of whether the published Third Secret is complete, whether the Vatican published everything that was in the envelope, whether the envelope contained everything Lucia wrote, whether Lucia wrote everything the figure told her, this question does not have a definitive answer in the public record. What the public record contains is a set of conflicting accounts, each with its own evidential support, none of which can be tested against the primary document, because the primary document is in the Vatican. The Vatican says the document is complete as published. The critics say it is not. Both sides point to evidence. Neither side has access sufficient to settle the question publicly beyond dispute. This is the mechanism at its most refined operation. John Paul II died on April 2nd. L'Ancien. He had been Pope for 26 years, the third longest pontificate in the Church's history, and one of the most consequential in the modern era. He had been the Pope of the Soviet collapse, of solidarity, of the Jubilee year, of the Third Secret's publication. He had visited more than 100 countries, beatified and canonized more individuals than all his predecessors combined, and produced a body of theological writing that would occupy Catholic scholars for generations. He had, in the specific terms of the Fatima tradition, been the central figure of the story that the tradition had been telling about the 20th century. He was the white-clad figure on the mountain. He was the man at the foot of the cross. He was the one whose survival the angels had secured, whose blood had been caught in the crystal goblets of a visionary description produced by a child in Portugal in 1917. The man who had survived, who had gone to Fatima, who had put the bullet in the crown. He was gone, and the Third Secret was published, and the mechanism was still running, because the publication of the Third Secret had not ended the dispute about whether it was complete, and the completion of John Paul II's pontificate had not ended the dispute about whether the consecration was valid, and the Soviet collapse, which had seemed, in 1991, like the definitive fulfillment of the Second Secret's promise, had been followed by a Russia that was not, by any common measure, converted in the theological sense the Fatima tradition implied. Vladimir Putin's Russia was not a secular democracy with religious freedom and peaceful international relations. It was an authoritarian state whose relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church was closer to the Tsarist model of state religion than to any vision of genuine conversion. It was a state that had invaded Georgia in 2008, annexed Crimea in 2014, and launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Russia had plainly not been transformed in the straightforward devotional sense many adherents had expected, which meant in the interpretive framework of the Fatima tradition one of three things. Either the consecration of 1984 had not been valid after all, and the conversion had not happened because the required act had not been properly performed, or the conversion of Russia was a longer process than the tradition's expectation had allowed for, and the current state of Russia was a temporary reversal of a trajectory that was still, ultimately, moving toward fulfillment. Or the Third Secret, the part that had been published, the part that may or may not be complete, contained something that explained the present situation in ways that had not yet been properly understood. Each of these interpretations was held by some portion of the Fatima tradition's adherents. Within the interpretive logic of the Fatima tradition, none of these readings could be easily ruled out from within the system itself. The mechanism was running. Pope Francis consecrated Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary on March 25th. He did so in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. which had begun on February 24th of that year, and which had created a geopolitical situation with direct and obvious resonance with the Fatima tradition's historic concerns, a Russian state engaged in military aggression, a Catholic population in Ukraine under threat, a pope making an act of consecration in the language and form of the Fatima requirement. The Fatima Center and the major Fatima apostolates around the world greeted the act with varying degrees of enthusiasm and varying degrees of scrutiny. Some confirmed it as finally, definitively, properly fulfilling the requirement, the explicit naming of Russia, the participation of bishops around the world, the solemn liturgical form. Others argued that the conditions still fell short. The participation of bishops was not universal enough. The explicit naming was not sufficiently distinguished from the simultaneous naming of Ukraine. The specific formula used deviated from the formula Lucia had specified. The debate was, in its structure, identical to the debate that had followed 1984. The act had been performed. The confirmation or rejection of the act was disputed. The consequences had not yet manifested in ways the tradition could evaluate. The mechanism was running, as it had been running since 1917. The history of Fatima gives strong reason to expect the mechanism will continue to run. What the Fatima tradition accomplished, across the century examined in this episode, was not a simple deception. It was not a Vatican conspiracy to suppress prophetic truth. Those specific actors within the Vatican made specific decisions that, taken together, created and sustained a structure of managed uncertainty. It was not a mass delusion of credulous people who wanted to believe in miracles. Though the tradition's power to generate belief in people whose critical faculties were otherwise intact is a datum that any honest account must register, it was something more precise, more interesting, and more instructive for understanding how prophetic systems function. It was the construction, over a century of institutional management and popular reception, of a framework so flexible, so structurally resistant to falsification, and so aligned with the psychological needs of the people who held it that it became, in the specific sense that Thomas Kuhn used for scientific paradigms, a way of seeing that organized all available evidence in its own favor. Every event that confirmed the tradition confirmed it. Every event that appeared to contradict the tradition was absorbed and reinterpreted until it confirmed the tradition. Every resolution was succeeded by a new source of unresolved expectation. The shooting of 1981, confirmation. The Soviet collapse of 1991, confirmation. The publication of the Third Secret in 2000, partial confirmation with new questions. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022, confirmation that the consecration of 1984 had been insufficient, or that the process of conversion was non-linear, or that the published Third Secret was incomplete. The mechanism does not produce falsifiable predictions. It produces events, historical events, real events. Events with real consequences for real people, and then absorbs those events into a framework that was designed not by cynical manipulation but by the cumulative logic of prophetic tradition, to be unfalsifiable. This is not a special feature of the Fatima tradition. It is the structure of all prophetic systems that survive long enough to be tested by history. What makes Fatima exceptional is the scale of the institutional investment, the papacy of the largest religious institution in the world, the archives of the Vatican, the theological output of some of the 20th century's most sophisticated minds, and the specificity of the historical context in which the tradition operated. The 20th century happened to produce the exact historical events: World War, totalitarianism, the assassination of a pope that a prophecy about war, Russia, and the suffering of the church required in order to appear confirmed. The tradition did not invent these events. The events were real. The suffering was real. The dead were real. But the interpretation of these events within the prophetic framework, the claim that they had been predicted, that their meaning was contained in a vision given to a 10-year-old girl in a Portuguese field in 1917, that the institution that managed the prophecy was the key to understanding and potentially averting the worst of what was coming. This interpretation was not a neutral description of the events. It was a meaning-making system, a powerful one, a durable one that, over a century of operation, produced believers, critics, institutions, theological controversies, acts of public worship, acts of political lobbying, acts of ecclesiastical management, and, in the specific moment of May 13th, Ichenjo by Basuyi, an act that placed a deformed bullet at the center of the most significant private revelation in modern Catholic history. The bullet is still in the crown. The Third Secret is published complete. According to the Vatican, incomplete. According to the critics, Russia has not been converted by any measure that the Fatima tradition would recognize as conversion. The Third Secret's publication was followed not by the end of speculation but by its intensification by books, websites, conferences, theological debates, and a sustained argumentative tradition that is, in 2026, as active and as unresolvable as it was in 1960. The mechanism runs, and understanding why it runs, why the specific combination of genuine visionary experience, institutional management, historical coincidence, and prophetic ambiguity produces a system this durable is not primarily a theological question or primarily a conspiracy question. It is a question about how human beings process uncertainty, about how institutions manage information that they cannot fully control, about how the gap between what we know and what we need to know gets filled with speculation, with prophecy, with the specific human capacity to find patterns in the noise of history and read those patterns as messages addressed to us. The three children at Kova Dairia, on May 13th, Ichenjo by Ishiti, saw something. What they saw, we do not know, cannot know, with the certainty that the tradition claims. What they reported, the institution processed. What the institution processed, the mechanism distributed. What the mechanism distributed, a century of believers and skeptics and popes and prison visitors and conspiracy theorists and careful theologians and elderly nuns and Turkish gunmen received and repeated and disputed and re-received. The word had been a weapon, not because anyone aimed it at a target, but because weapons, once loose from the hand that threw them, travel on their own momentum, and the momentum of 1917 has not yet stopped.